Hello Neighbor is about personal and internal demons who we nurture along the way, with the only way defeating them to face them and conquer them. Hi folks, I'm R, your narrator. You can follow me on Twitter where you can send me game suggestions. This video will contain spoilers. With that said, let's begin. Nicky Roth, the neighborhood kid, accidentally hears cries for help coming from his neighbor's house. He peeks through the window and witnesses the struggles of Mr. Peterson, looking an unseen person into the basement. Mr. Peterson breaks down crying, but then soon recollects himself and suddenly notices Nicky and catches him. This provides Nicky with some backstory of what happened to Mr. Peterson in a nightmare fashion. In a tragic accident, Mr. Peterson seemingly lost his wife, hinted out as a high heel is lying randomly on the street, with him slowly approaching his crashing car. Another nightmare shows how Mr. Peterson buried his wife and became the wreck he is now, as seen through his breakdowns, and his car crashed into the garden fence. There are several child missing posters of two children, a girl and a boy, who seem to have been the children of Mr. Peterson. As Nicky manages to sneak into Mr. Peterson's house and open the locked basement door, he witnesses a heavily secured room with paintings of outside, creating an illusion of windows. There's a mattress in the middle of the room and empty cans of food, seemingly someone being held captive here. As Nicky explores more, he encounters a door with 3 different padlocks, colored red, green, and yellow, when suddenly Mr. Peterson reaches him and captures him. Nicky wakes up on the mattress in the basement, which seems to be a few weeks later, at least, as he's missing a shoe and his sock has holes in it, depicting passage of time. As Nicky manages to get out of the house, he is shocked with the spectacle of what Mr. Peterson has built. He has erected high-rising fence panels with nets and barbed wires, presumably to keep Nicky in. Nicky has few nightmares while confined within the neighbor's premise. One nightmare shows what a large theme park-like house Mr. Peterson has built, which he then gets on a rail cart. There's a cutout board of a boy, which seems to be the son of Theodore or Mr. Peterson, with a final cutout board of a girl, which the cart pushes away at the top of the rail, with 2 cutout board hands protracting from the cart. This in a way suggests the son of Mr. Peterson, who could have pushed away the daughter, whether literally or metaphorically. Another nightmare shows more details of Mr. Peterson's down spiral to insanity and mental breakdown. It shows a hospital bed, presumably of his wife, after the accident, with him slowly losing hopes in the waiting room, showing how he became an impatient, bitter man after the loss of his wife. After some time, Nicky manages to escape in fear, with Mr. Peterson giving him a deep, dirty look as he runs, which leads to PTSD in Nicky, which he carries to his adulthood. Several years later, Nicky has grown up to be an adult, living in an apartment by himself. He suddenly receives a letter, which is an eviction notice, leaving him with no other option than to go back to his childhood home. In there, he witnesses the once lively suburban neighborhood succumbing to a dilapidated, abandoned-like state. Mr. Peterson's house has become completely demolished, which he feels the necessity to check out, and maybe overcome his fears he obtained long ago. A mysterious shadow lurks in this place, which follows Nicky around, causing him to have a panic attack and his vision becoming blurry. It's a possibility that Mr. Peterson ran away from his house after being found out to have locked Nicky in his basement to run away from the authorities. Nicky recollects himself and heads back to his abandoned childhood home with the windows being boarded up. He seems fidgety and on edge, staring at the site where his neighbor's house used to be on. The telephone then suddenly rings, with strange sounds being heard. Nicky looks through the window, seeing the shadow-like figure looking at him across the road, which terrifies him, forcing himself to sleep to maybe feel better. In his sleep, he dreams of the neighbor boarding up a door with screams heard from the other side. The neighbor looks at Nicky, which suddenly wakes him up. As he awakens, he finds himself in a well-repaired, furnished house with a massive house built across from him, where his neighbor's house used to be. As he goes inside the house, he comes across a room with several CCTV monitors and paintings of eyes, portraying how Nicky feels like he's being watched all the time by Mr. Peterson, even after several years since he escaped him. Mr. Peterson himself is present in this house, yet again chasing after Nicky, creating a surreal experience that might be happening in Nicky's head. Nicky unlocks a door with a red padlock on, similar to one of the padlocks on the door with 3 different colored padlocks. The world then suddenly becomes very large, or maybe Nicky becomes extremely small. A metaphor to how he might have seen himself in Mr. Peterson's house when he was younger. He manages to overcome the obstacles in the room and get back to his normal size. Nicky then picks up a green key and subsequently opens a door with a green padlock, yet again similar to another padlock on the basement door. In there, he encounters a classroom-like sinister place infested with moving mannequins on a periodic time intervals, stopping and moving when a classroom bell rings. This might portray how strict Mr. Peterson was when homeschooling Nicky during his confinement, or simply Nicky's fear of school. The next segment of this room portrays Nicky's fear of supermarkets and shopping, as he carries a shopping cart with him, with hostile mannequins all around him. After managing to escape this room with the green padlock, Nicky then could encounter an out-of-map graveyard with Mr. Peterson's wife's grave being visible. Finally, Nicky is able to go through the basement door, which teleports him into a surreal version of the actual basement he was trapped in several years before. In there, he sees the shadow figure emitting lights from his eyes, looking for him. Nicky manages to go through the door with 3 different colored padlocks, which shows the room with the mattress with a cutout board of Mr. Peterson's son, depicting who Mr. Peterson was locking there before Nicky found out and ended up having the same fate. Looking through the windows, Nicky witnesses a gigantic version of Mr. Peterson staring at him, portraying how small Nicky sees himself in front of him. Mr. Peterson destroys the room, which allows Nicky to leave whilst being chased by him. Mr. Peterson in here has his house behind his back, which is a display of the pain of loss of his family, which he carries on his back, weighing down on him. The house being a constant dark reminder of when he lost his family. Nicky manages to go to the house on Mr. Peterson's back, which teleports him to a dark, eerie place, overflooded with missing child posters and a large dark shadow figure being ever present. The shadow figure follows Mr. Peterson around as he's spreading the posters while crying and drinking. The house on Mr. Peterson's back is a representation of his mind and how much he suffered for the loss of his family. Nicky then teleports into a different reality and observes his child self playing in a third perspective view, sitting in front of large windows. Looking out of the window, the small shadow figure festers and becomes larger, which terrifies the child Nicky, who runs around. The shadow follows him and breaks parts of the construction in front of him. The adult Nicky can protect the child Nicky by standing in front of him, preventing the shadow figure hitting him. The more and more Nicky faces off the shadow figure, the larger and larger he becomes, until he's bigger than the shadow figure. It's only at that point that the shadow stops punching the construction and disappears. This teleports Nicky to a white space with a house, which is where Mr. Peterson is trapped within. He has barricaded a door, which has the shadow figure in, with Mr. Peterson being terrified and crying, having different variations of fears himself. The adult Nicky then wakes up in his house, who seems happier and sees the world in a different light. He proceeds to unload his stuff from his car while whistling and deciding to finally have a good life.
Hey.
According to the cutout board, Mr. Peterson's son was trapped within the basement, which Nicky sees, leading to him being trapped as well, not to tell on him and inform the authorities. After several years, it's clear that Nicky's short experience, being locked in their neighbor's basement, left a massive toll on him, giving him severe anxiety and PTSD, looking at the world in a depressing tone, and still carrying a sharp fear of his neighbor, even being an adult now and larger than the neighbor. Despite that, at the end he sees the neighbor being a giant, displaying how terrified he still is of him. The locked door with 3 different colors of padlocks, leading to the room with fake windows and mattress, definitely left a severe impression on Nicky, who faces each padlock one by one in the imaginary house he enters, where he faces individual fears of himself, such as school and supermarket. The shadow that lurked in the ruins of Mr. Peterson's house, which followed Nicky in his dream, tormenting both Mr. Peterson and Nicky, is the representation of fear, both in different variations. For Nicky, his fear of being imprisoned by Mr. Peterson, and for Mr. Peterson, his fear of loss and loneliness. In the finale, Nicky faces off his crippling fear embodied in the shadow figure. After each hit and standing against it, he becomes larger and larger until he becomes bigger than his fear, destroying it, letting his childhood victim become finally free. Therefore, his imagination taking him to the neighbor's house, facing him and the doors with different padlocks, was the only way he could overcome his anxiety and PTSD, which eventually makes him happy and lets him live the life he wants to live, without the massive fear burdening him anymore. This is portrayed in the world, being seen in brighter colors. This leaves Mr. Peterson, who's still tormented by his fear, the loss of his wife and children. He's trapped in a house, constantly being reminded of it. There's a secret ending that breaks him free, but we'll leave that for another video. That's it for today's video, folks. I'm going to make a subsequent video diving deeper in the ending and the secret ending, focusing more on the backstory of the neighbor. You can follow me on Twitter and send me game suggestions such as this one. And as always, it's been your host Dar. Till the next video, have a fantastic day.